Have you ever heard of Moab? A mysterious land with a controversial past and an unexpected connection to the lineage of Jesus. What really happened to this people? What secrets are hidden between the lines of biblical history? And how did a beginning filled with controversy end up intertwining with the greatest name in Christianity? Stay until the end, because the truth about Moab might completely change the way you see the Bible. After the catastrophic destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the scene that unfolded was one of absolute desolation. Lot, the only survivor of the disaster, walked with his two daughters through a barren and lifeless land. The fire and brimstone had devastated everything he knew, and the echo of destruction still resonated in his mind. Panic and the feeling of being watched by a higher power accompanied him with every step, and he, now exiled in a cave in the mountains, reflected on the end of humanity as he knew it. The loneliness became unbearable. The daughters, who had also lost everything, friends, family, home, were weighed down by a cruel and relentless reality. Alone, with no hope that a new generation could arise, they feared that their family, although spared from God's fire, might somehow be extinguished. There was a profound emptiness, not only physical but spiritual, and the urgency to preserve their lineage was stronger than the fear of what might come next. One night, while Lot slept drunkenly from wine, the daughters gathered in secret. The decision they made echoed in the depths of their souls and carried an unimaginable weight. They could not allow humanity to disappear with them. So, in a cruel and thoughtless way, they began what would be an act that altered not only the fate of their own family, but that of an entire future nation. The alcohol clouded Lot's mind, and his daughters, with no other option, continued the act of preserving the lineage, not foreseeing the repercussions of what they were about to create. From that incestuous event, Moab would be born, a boy whose origin, dark and marked by betrayal and despair, would carry the weight of being the son of a forbidden relationship. His brother Ben-Ami would also be born from this tragedy, and thus the formation of two peoples began, the Moabites and the Ammonites. As history continued to unfold, a shadow hung over them. Moab would, throughout his existence, be marked by doubt and the disdain of neighboring peoples, especially the Israelites, who viewed his origin with horror. However, despite the tragedy, life went on. Moab and Ben-Ami grew and took shape, but their story would be marked by disputes, tensions, and a constant struggle to find their place in the vast and unforgiving world around them. Moab's past, which began so tragically and controversially, would not be easily forgotten, but at the same time, it could not prevent the future that he and his descendants would still write. As the story of Moab began to unfold in the desolate lands east of the Dead Sea, the meaning of his name began to be whispered among the few who still understood the weight of words. Moab. In Hebrew, the name translates to "from the father," a direct reference to his dark origin, a legacy of incest. It was a designation loaded with symbolism, evoking not only the birth of a people, but also the burden that this people would carry through the generations. For the Moabites, this name did not have an immediate weight. It was simply the name of their lineage, the reflection of a newly formed identity, born out of fear and the desire for survival. But for those looking from the outside, especially the Israelites, the name Moab was a constant reminder of what they considered a shameful origin. From the father, this did not go unnoticed. The name was seen as a curse, a reminder of the sin and immorality that accompanied it. For the Israelites, the bond with Lot, their uncle, was a bond hard to digest, given the context of Moab's creation. Over the centuries, this name echoed through conflicts and territorial disputes. When the Moabites crossed borders to face the Israelites, the very name of their nation carried a weight that went beyond the battlefield. It was a reminder of their impure roots and the constant tension between these two peoples, who, despite sharing a common ancestor in Turah, saw each other with distrust and hostility. Yet, the name of Moab was not just a sign of shame or rejection. It also reflected an internal complexity. In its fertile lands, Moab thrived. Its inhabitants, over time, began to associate the name with resistance and survival, overcoming their difficult origins to create a strong and independent nation. While the surrounding lands suffered from invasions and the decline of other civilizations, Moab stood firm, supported by its strategic position and the natural wealth it possessed. However, the perception of the Israelites never faded. To them, Moab would always be from the father, a reminder that lineages, no matter how prosperous they became, could never erase the mark of their origin. And so Moab, with its name marked by controversy and the complexity of its roots, navigated a world that, while always waiting for an opportunity to judge them, was also attentive to the strength and resilience that the Moabite people had earned over the years. East of the Dead Sea, in a region of arid mountains and vast deserts, Moab found its home. The land, seemingly inhospitable and wild, hid an impressive wealth, fertile soil and strategic access to the trade routes of the time. This location was not only geographically significant, but also politically advantageous. While the rest of the region around the Dead Sea was marked by barrenness, Moab enjoyed a more welcoming terrain, with plains and mountains that housed everything from small villages to large trading centers. Moab's geographical position gave it a great advantage in terms of defense and trade. On one side, the imposing mountains formed a natural barrier against invaders, making incursions into the land more difficult. On the other side, the fertile valley along the Arnon River provided ideal conditions for farming and livestock. This wealth did not go unnoticed. Moab became a key point for merchants crossing the region, becoming an essential link in the trade between Egypt and the northern kingdoms. However, the same strategic location that gave Moab an economic and defensive advantage also made the region a target of disputes. Its proximity to the Israelites, with their own territorial interests and ambitions, fueled a constant rivalry. The mountain passes leading to Moab were often traversed by marching armies eager to expand their territories or protect their borders. Moab was, therefore, in a delicate position. Although it was a land of abundance, it was always at risk of being absorbed or invaded by neighboring powers. The region, also filled with forts and walled cities, was a symbol of resistance. In the heart of Moab, there were ruins and temples dedicated to Chemosh, their warrior and fertility god, whose statues and altars were erected in prominent places. While trade and agriculture ensured its survival, it was military power that allowed Moab to maintain its independence for so many centuries. The land, like a rare jewel, required its rulers to make tough choices, navigating political intrigue and alliances with neighboring peoples to preserve their autonomy. And as the merchant caravans passed along the Arnon, exchanging spices, metals, and textiles, the land of Moab followed its course, with its inhabitants accustomed to the sound of war drums and the murmur of diplomats negotiating to secure a piece of the rich Moabite land. The history of Moab and Israel is marked by constant tension, despite a common origin that traces back to Terah, the patriarch who was the father of Abraham. The ancestral connection between the two peoples should, in theory, have created a foundation of brotherhood, but the reality was very different. From the beginning, the rivalry between the two nations was drawn with an intensity that would span the centuries. When Lot and Abraham separated, each went their own way in search of new lands. Lot settled near Sodom, while Abraham continued his journey to Canaan. This separation, although peaceful at the time, opened a gap that would only deepen as the years went by. When the Israelites began to migrate to the Promised Land, the region of Moab was in their path, and coexistence between the two peoples quickly proved difficult. Soon, the interaction between Moab and Israel became defined by territorial disputes. Moab, with its strategic and abundant territory, did not welcome the presence of Israelites nearby. This led to a series of confrontations and hostility. Even though they shared a common ancestor, the differences between the two peoples grew deep, primarily due to religious and cultural issues. While the Israelites worshipped the God of Abraham, the Moabites followed Chemosh, a warrior and fertility god, whose often violent rituals were misunderstood and despised by the Israelites. The Israelites, in turn, saw the Moabites as a threat to their faith and identity. The rivalry was not just political or territorial, it was for the most part spiritual. During the Exodus, when the Israelites tried to pass through the land of Moab on their way to the Promised Land, they were stopped by King Balak. Fearing that the Israelites might become a military or political threat, Balak tried by all means to discredit Israel's power. He hired Balaam, a prophet, to curse the Israelites, but surprisingly, instead of cursing them, Balaam blessed them, making it clear that for the Moabites, God's power over Israel was undeniable. The animosity between Moab and Israel continued for generations. The battles for land control, religious and cultural differences, and the competition for political power in the Near East all contributed to the perpetuation of the rivalry. Even when the two peoples were forced to cooperate at times, distrust never completely disappeared. However, this relationship wasn't solely defined by hostility. Throughout history, there were also moments of compassion and understanding. The example of Ruth, a Moabite who married Boaz, an Israelite, shows that even though the ties between the peoples were tense, there was still room for acceptance based on faith and character. By integrating into the Israelite people, Ruth proved that, even amid separation and rivalry, humanity and redemption could transcend the boundaries between peoples. Nonetheless, the legacy of distrust and animosity between Moab and Israel continued to shape history, reflecting the deep divisions that existed between them. Even though, in times of peace, both peoples shared some victories and prosperity, the scars of the past were always present, reminding everyone of the difficult coexistence between two peoples who, despite having a common origin, were distant in many ways. In the heart of Moab, where the mountains meet the fertile valleys, King Balak watched with concern as the Israelites advanced toward his land. The Israeli army, having escaped Egyptian rule, had conquered lands and moved through the desert. News of Israel's victories over its enemies spread like wildfire. King Balak, fearing that the Israelites might invade his lands and destroy his people, decided to take drastic measures. In his mind, the solution lay in a powerful figure, someone with a direct connection to the spiritual world: Balaam, a prophet known for his ability to invoke blessings and curses. If Balak could get Balaam to curse the Israelites, he believed he could ward off the threat to his kingdom. Balak's faith in Balaam's ability to bring a curse upon Israel's enemies was deeply rooted in the beliefs of the time, when it was thought that the words of a prophet could change the fate of an entire people. With this intention, Balak sent messengers to find Balaam, offering him generous gifts and wealth. The messengers, with sweet words, arrived and told Balaam that the situation was urgent and that his help could save Moab. After consulting God, Balaam received a clear message: "Do not curse the people of Israel, for they are blessed." Despite Balak's tempting offer, Balaam initially refused, following God's command. However, Balak, unwilling to give up, insisted. He sent even more messengers, offering even greater rewards, promising honor and abundant wealth. Balaam, seduced by the promise of a great reward, decided to consult God again. At that moment, God, in his wisdom, allowed Balaam to go, but warned him that he would only speak what God commanded. When Balaam arrived, he met with Balak, and the king, impatient, led him to a high mountain where he could see the large Israelite camp below. Balak, anxious to hear the curse, asked Balaam to pronounce it. However, when Balaam opened his mouth to curse Israel, to everyone's surprise, words of blessing flowed from his mouth, declaring Israel's greatness and victorious future. King Balak, astonished and furious, tried again, taking Balaam to another mountain, hoping he would succeed in pronouncing a curse. But once again, Balaam, inspired by God, declared blessings over the Israelites. This series of events not only frustrated Balak, but also clearly demonstrated God's sovereignty over the destinies of nations. Balak, desperate and humiliated, finally gave up on the idea of cursing Israel. The episode between Balak and Balaam was etched in everyone's memory as a powerful reminder of the impossibility of thwarting divine plans. No matter how strong Balak's desire to defeat Israel was, God showed once again that his purposes cannot be frustrated by any human or spiritual force. In the end, although the king of Moab failed in his attempt, he did not abandon his hostility toward Israel. The seeds of rivalry between the two peoples continued to grow, but in this specific moment, the story of Balak and Balaam became a milestone, a reminder that God's will would always prevail, regardless of human efforts to divert it. In the context of a people marked by disputes and divisions, the story of Ruth, a Moabite, emerges as a beacon of faith, loyalty, and redemption. Her journey begins in a moment of deep tragedy when an Israelite family is forced to leave their homeland and take refuge in Moab due to a great famine in Israel. This family consisted of Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons. When they arrived in Moab, they found temporary refuge, but the family's life would soon be marked by devastating losses. In Moab, Elimelech's sons, Mahlon and Chilion, married Moabite women. One of them was Ruth, a woman who, despite belonging to Israel's rival people, married an Israelite out of love. Life in the foreign land, however, was not kind to this family. In a short time, Elimelech and his 2 sons died, leaving Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law widowed and helpless. Naomi, alone and with no prospects, decided to return to Israel, believing that her life in Moab had already been marked by misfortune. However, contrary to expectations, both daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, refused to leave her. Naomi, aware of the hardships that awaited women in Israel, tried to persuade them to stay in Moab, where they could remarry and rebuild their lives. While Orpah, with a heavy heart, chose to go her own way in Moab, Ruth made a different decision, one that would forever change the course of her personal story and the history of Israel. Ruth, with a spirit and loyalty that defied all expectations, declared to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." These words were not just a promise of fidelity to her mother-in-law, but also an act of deep faith in the God of Israel. Even though she was Moabite and a foreigner, Ruth gave herself to the people of Israel, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and sincere belief in the God whom her mother-in-law worshipped. When they arrived in Bethlehem, Ruth wasted no time and began working in the fields, gathering the leftover barley after the harvest to support herself and Naomi. It was at this moment that she met Boaz, a man of good reputation, a relative of Naomi, and with whom there was a family connection. Boaz, noticing Ruth's dedication, showed her unexpected favor, allowing her to gather more than usual and ensuring her protection from the field workers. Over time, Naomi, realizing that Boaz was an upright and generous man, devised a plan for Ruth to meet him and symbolically ask him to fulfill the role of Goel, a close relative who had the responsibility of redeeming a family's lost inheritance, including marrying the widow of a brother. When Ruth followed Naomi's advice and went to Boaz, he, moved by Ruth's loyalty and humility, promised to fulfill the role of Goel, but first, he needed to ensure that the right to redeem the inheritance passed to a closer relative. Finally, after the legal process was settled, Boaz and Ruth married. What began as a story of loss and despair became a story of redemption and restoration. Together, Boaz and Ruth had a son, Obed, who became the grandfather of King David, one of Israel's greatest heroes. Ruth's lineage, a Moabite, would thus be part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, symbolizing the inclusion and grace of God that transcends borders and barriers, extending salvation to all people. Ruth's story is not only about a woman's faithfulness to her mother-in-law, but about how God used a foreigner to fulfill his divine plans. Ruth, the Moabite, with her faith and loyalty, became one of the most important figures in Israel's history, remembered for her courage, character, and the way her lineage would lead to the birth of the world's Savior. The tension between the people of Israel and Moab had been forged over centuries, and the difference in beliefs, customs, and even the animosity between the two nations created distances that were hard to overcome. After the exodus from Egypt and the establishment of Israel in the Promised Land, the instructions given by God, through Moses, aimed to preserve the spiritual and cultural purity of Israel. These instructions, often harsh, reflected the need to separate Israel from foreign influences that could lead the people away from true worship of God. One of the clearest and most emphatic orders was in Deuteronomy 23 verse 3, which prohibited the Moabites from entering the assembly of the Lord. The reason behind this prohibition was not only the historical rivalry between the two peoples, but also specific acts of hostility the Moabites had shown against the Israelites. When Israel was approaching Moab during their journey through the desert, King Balak attempted to use Balaam to curse God's people, as we've already seen. Furthermore, instead of offering hospitality, the Moabites chose to resist and antagonize the Israelites. And worse, the idolatrous temptations of Moab caused many Israelites to stray from true worship of God, which further displeased the Israelite leaders. The prohibition, therefore, was both a reflection of historical hostility and an attempt to prevent the influence of a people whose gods and religious practices were in opposition to Israel's monotheism from penetrating the spiritual core of the nation. God, in his wisdom, knew that if the Israelites began associating with the Moabites, it could be harmful to their worship and faithfulness to him. The separation, in this case, was not just a political matter, but a matter of spiritual purity. However, as we see in Ruth's story, things are not always as simple and definitive as the orders may suggest. Even though the prohibition was in place, God, in his infinite grace, showed that mercy could transcend the limits imposed by the law. Ruth, the Moabite, was not only accepted among the Israelites but became a heroine and an ancestor of David, Israel's greatest king, and even the Messiah. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her sincere desire to follow the God of Israel created a unique exception, showing that, in the end, genuine faith and faithfulness to God could overcome ethnic and cultural barriers. The fact that Ruth was accepted for her faith, not her origin, highlighted a fundamental truth in the scriptures. The purity of the heart and obedience to God are more important than lineage or nationality. While Moses' law had instituted a separation, God's grace extended to all who turned to him sincerely, regardless of their background or status. This tension between prohibition and acceptance reflected the complexity of relationships between the peoples of the time. On one hand, Moses' law sought to protect Israel from external influences that could lead them to idolatry. But on the other, God showed that his grace had no boundaries, extending even to the Moabites, if they were willing to abandon their idols and turn to him with a sincere heart. Therefore, Ruth's story becomes an example of how God can redeem even those from complicated places and histories. Ruth was not just a simple Moabite. She was a woman who fully devoted herself to the God of Israel, and it was this devotion that made her an example of faith and obedience. Her legacy would later become crucial to the story of redemption that God was preparing for all humanity. The religion of the Moabites was deeply rooted in practices and beliefs that opposed Israelite monotheism. Unlike Israel, which worshipped the one true God, the Moabites followed a polytheistic religious tradition, believing in various gods and goddesses who governed aspects of daily life. At the center of their worship was Chemosh, a deity of great importance, known for his association with both war and fertility. He was seen as the protector of the Moabite people, ensuring them victory in battle and prosperity in agriculture, two essential areas for the survival of any ancient civilization. Chemosh, therefore, was more than just a god. He was the symbol of everything the Moabites valued and believed necessary to maintain their identity and prosperity as a nation. For the Moabites, worship of Chemosh represented the source of their strength and protection, but it also demanded a deep and sometimes disturbing commitment. Among the most shocking practices was human sacrifice, which became a central element in many religious ceremonies. The Moabites believed that in order to guarantee the favor of their gods and secure victories in battle or good harvests, they needed to offer extremely valuable sacrifices, and no sacrifice was more valuable than human life. This dark aspect of Moabite religion led Israel and other neighboring peoples to view them with repulsion and horror. Human sacrifice, though common in some ancient cultures, stood in stark contrast to Israel's religious practices, which involved animal offerings as a means of atonement for sins. For the Israelites, human sacrifice was an abominable act, something that directly violated God's commandments, which stated, "You shall not murder," and that the sacrifices offered to the Lord should be made with a pure heart, not with the shedding of innocent blood. The practice of human sacrifice reached its peak in one of the most shocking episodes of Moabite history, when King Mesha, in a moment of desperation, made a terrible sacrifice to Chemosh. During a battle against Israel, King Mesha, surrounded and seeing his defeat imminent, decided to sacrifice his own son, the heir to the throne, as a last-ditch attempt to appease Chemosh and ensure victory. This act of extreme brutality not only shocked the Israelites, but also forever tainted the image of the Moabites, as, according to the Bible, the sacrifice resulted in divine wrath against the Moabite people. The death of the prince undoubtedly did not bring salvation, but only deepened the suffering of the Moabite kingdom. Despite all the cruelty and alienation caused by the Moabite religious practices, the biblical story reminds us that, like many other ancient cultures, the Moabites also had moments of mercy and compassion, especially when compared to the other peoples around them. However, their efforts to please the gods through acts of violence and pain were a reflection of a faith based on fear, rather than love and true worship of a sovereign God. The relationship between Israel and the Moabite religion was marked by rejection, mainly because Moabite worship practices were seen as a threat to the purity of the worship of God. However, over time, this distance gave way to a deeper criticism of idolatry in all its forms, not only in Moab, but also among the Israelites themselves. The worship of Chemosh and other pagan gods became a symbol of the temptations that could turn the hearts of the Israelites away from their true God, and this is reflected in the warnings given by the biblical prophets throughout the centuries. In the end, the history of the Moabite religion, with its emphasis on the worship of Chemosh and human sacrifices, serves as a reminder of how the beliefs of a people can shape their practices and actions, and how true worship should be centered on love, not fear. The Bible, by recounting these episodes, invites us to reflect on the choices we make in our own journey of faith, and how they can bring us closer to or further from God. The story of Eglon, king of Moab, is one of the most dramatic and surprising episodes in the scriptures, revealing a combination of cruelty, strategy, and even a dose of divine irony. Moab, for many years, held considerable power over neighboring nations, including Israel, whose tribes were being constantly oppressed by their rulers. King Eglon, in particular, was not only an imposing figure, but also extremely relentless in his actions, determined to keep Israel under domination and submission. For 18 long years, the Israelites lived under the weight of Moabite oppression. Eglon, with his military strength, had imposed heavy tribute on Israel, something that drained the people's freedom and kept them from prospering. The people of Israel, weary of humiliation and misery, cried out to God for deliverance. As is often the case in the scriptures, this cry awakened divine compassion, and God chose to act in a surprising way to free his people from servitude. God raised up an unlikely man to confront Eglon. Ehud, a man from the tribe of Benjamin, described as a left-handed man, something that at the time could be seen as a rare and even disadvantageous trait. However, God used this peculiarity to fulfill his plans, choosing Ehud to carry out a mission that seemed impossible. Cunning and fearless, Ehud devised a meticulously calculated plan. He knew that the only way to confront King Eglon was to enter his palace directly, something extremely risky given the power and security of the Moabite court. Using his dexterity, he hid a sharp sword on his right thigh, knowing that most guards would only look for weapons on the left thigh, a common assumption at the time. When he presented himself before Eglon, Ehud requested a private audience with the king, claiming to have a secret message from God. The king, suspicious but curious, ordered all his servants to leave the room, allowing Ehud to approach him. It was at this moment that Ehud's courage and faith were put to the test. Instead of simply delivering a message, as Eglon expected, Ehud struck a deadly blow, plunging the sword into the king's abdomen. The blow was so violent that, according to the scriptures, the sword completely disappeared into his body, and the fat of Eglon swallowed it up, a detail both grotesque and symbolic of how Moabite oppression would be quickly suppressed. Ehud wasted no time. After Eglon's death, he silently escaped, locking the king's chamber doors. When Eglon's servants arrived to check on the king, they found the macabre scene, and, believing he was merely resting, took some time to realize the true situation. This precious time allowed Ehud to rally the Israeli forces for a revolt. Armed and motivated, the Israelites attacked the Moabites, who were disorganized and without leadership, achieving a decisive victory. The death of Eglon was not just an act of revenge, but a divine intervention that brought liberation to Israel. The people, finally free from oppression, enjoyed a period of peace for 80 years under Ehud's leadership, who became a revered judge, guiding Israel away from idolatry and the oppression that had marked them. The story of Eglon and his downfall is not just a tale of justice, but also a powerful testimony of the way God chooses to act in times of need. God used Ehud, an unlikely man with a unique trait, to fulfill his plan of liberation. This episode also highlights divine irony. While Eglon thought he was safe in his arrogance and power, he fell in a humiliating and unexpected way, symbolizing the fragility of human kingdoms when they oppose God's will. The relationship between Moab and Israel was marked by cycles of tension and conflict, but also spiritual seduction and attraction to Moabite worship practices. The geography, cultural values, and religion of Moab often clashed with Israel's principles and faith. While the Moabites worshipped Chemosh and practiced shocking rituals such as human sacrifice, the Israelites were called to worship the one true God and follow his commandments. This fundamental difference made the interaction between the two peoples a constant struggle for the preservation of Israel's spiritual and cultural identity. What is interesting in the story, however, is that despite the hostility and military conflicts, the Moabites also had an insidious influence on the Israelites. In times of vulnerability, the Israelites were often seduced by the promises of prosperity and security that the Moabites offered, mainly through their religious practices. The worship of Chemosh, with its feasts and rituals, seemed like an appealing alternative to those who were tired of the rigidity of Israelite religion or who sought a more immediate form of relief. It was in this context that, over the centuries, the Moabites were able to, over time, attract some Israelites to their cults, especially in the border areas where the two cultures met. The story of Balak and Balaam, for example, illustrates how the Moabites tried, through tricks and charms, to turn Israel's heart away from their God. King Balak, desperate to defeat Israel, did not hesitate to use a spiritual strategy by calling the prophet Balaam to curse God's people. Instead, God intervened, and Balaam, instead of cursing, ended up pronouncing blessings over Israel. This episode showed that, while the Moabites tried to seduce Israel with charms and rituals, the God of Israel was in control, protecting his people. However, this spiritual temptation continued to be a constant threat. The Moabites not only imposed their culture and religion openly, but also through political and marital alliances. The marriage of Moab with the people of Israel was, throughout history, one of the greatest challenges to the purity of Israelite faith. The famous episode of Balaam, who used his words to incite the Israelites to engage with Moabite women in marriages and religious festivals, reflected a more insidious strategy to weaken moral integrity and loyalty to the God of Israel. When the Israelites united with Moabite women, it marked the beginning of a cycle of apostasy and spiritual decline. The Moabite women, with their influences and religious practices, led the Israelites away from their worship of the Lord. This distance led to a weakening of Israel's spiritual identity, causing a series of crises, including plagues and defeats in battles. The attraction of Moabite practices came at a high cost for Israel, as the Israelites often found themselves losing the spiritual battle within their own hearts. Furthermore, the temptation to worship other gods was not just a matter of faith, but also of identity and survival. The Moabites were often seen as a military threat, a powerful force in their region. However, the real battle, as revealed in the scriptures, was not just against the Moabites as a military force, but against the principles of loyalty and obedience to God. The struggle against the Moabites, therefore, was tied to Israel's internal struggle to maintain its spiritual purity and loyalty to the covenant God had made with their ancestors. The relationship between Moab and Israel, with their territorial, cultural, and religious disputes, was a profound lesson on how proximity to cultures that reject the principles of God can undermine a people's faith and values. When Israel succumbed to the Moabite temptation, it paid a high price, not just militarily, but spiritually. However, as the biblical story shows, there was always an opportunity for repentance and restoration. Even in the darkest times, God did not abandon his people, and the history of Moab and Israel serves as a warning about the dangers of drifting away from faithfulness to God, but also about the power of grace and restoration. The story of Moab as a regional power is fascinating, as it shows how a small kingdom, located between great empires and nations, managed to stand out for a time. Although Moab was often considered a lesser nation compared to the superpowers of the time, such as Egypt, Israel, or Babylon, its geographical location and its commercial and military abilities ensured it a strategic role in the region. Moab established itself east of the Dead Sea, a region of great fertility and importance. Its lands, rich in natural resources and with a climate favorable for agriculture, were an ideal base for trade and survival. This privileged location made Moab a crossroads for various trade routes connecting Egypt, the Near East, and other important lands of antiquity. As a result, the Moabites not only prospered economically, but also became an essential part of the trade network that fueled the region's economy. This commercial prosperity made Moab a constant target of territorial disputes, especially with Israel. The Moabites were known for their skill in negotiation, but also for their courage in defending their borders. The trade of salt and other essential products helped maintain Moab's stable economy, and over the years, the kingdom became a respected regional power. But like many emerging powers, Moab knew that stability depended on maintaining good relations with its more powerful neighbors and ensuring that its lands were effectively defended. Moab's military strength was a combination of its mountainous terrain and the skill of its warriors. The mountains of Moab were natural defenders, and its armies were known for being fierce and well-trained. Although Moab was frequently involved in conflicts with Israel, it also had a history of alliances and trade agreements with other nations. This balance between military strength and diplomacy allowed Moab to maintain its independence for a long time, even in the face of external pressures. But despite its strength and prosperity, Moab was always vulnerable. More powerful kingdoms, such as the Assyrians and Babylonians, eventually began expanding their domains, pressuring smaller kingdoms like Moab. This led to a constant struggle for survival, and eventually to Moab's assimilation by these larger empires. The rise and fall of Moab as a regional power reflect the political volatility of the time, where alliances were often temporary and military victories did not guarantee long-term stability. Moab's resistance against Israel and other peoples was also a reflection of its determination to maintain its identity and position in the region. Moab was not a nation easily subjugated, and its ability to remain self-sufficient and strategic ensured its longevity as an independent kingdom longer than many expected. However, like many nations of antiquity, Moab eventually succumbed to the power of larger empires, gradually disappearing as an independent political entity. Despite this, the story of Moab as a regional power still echoes in the scriptures, as it shows how a nation can rise, prosper, and fight for its survival. Even in its fall, Moab left a mark on biblical history, reminding us that human kingdoms are temporary, but cultural and spiritual influence can endure through the ages. The Mesha stele, also known as the Moabite stone, is one of the most significant archaeological finds for understanding the history of Moab and its relationship with Israel. Discovered in 1868, this inscription was made by King Mesha himself, the Moabite ruler who became one of the most notable figures in Moabite history. The stele, dated to the 9th century BCE, is a stone inscription that narrates Moab's revolt against Israel and the king's attempt to restore his kingdom's independence after the oppression imposed by the Israelites. The text carved on the stone is written in an ancient form of Hebrew, but it is notable for being one of the earliest and most complete Moabite accounts of the confrontation with Israel. King Mesha, in his inscription, provides details about how he was able to rebel against Israeli rule, defeating Israelite forces and restoring Moab to its former glory. According to the inscription, Mesha's victory over Israel was accompanied by the reclaiming of cities and territories that had been lost during the period of subordination to the Kingdom of Israel. King Mesha specifically mentions the city of Nebo, one of the most important cities for the people of Moab. He describes the destruction of several Israelite cities during the revolt, which not only shows the military resilience of Moab, but also the deep desire of the Moabite people to regain their autonomy. This kind of account, where the king glorifies his victory, is common in ancient inscriptions, but what makes the Mesha stele especially important is the historical context it provides. The Mesha stele offers a unique perspective on the Moabite view of the conflict. Unlike Israelite sources, which often focused on their victories and on showing the power of the God of Israel, the Mesha inscription shows the other side of the story, the suffering of Moab under Israeli rule and its fight for freedom. Furthermore, the inscription refers to details that match other biblical sources, such as the war against Israel and the presence of a Moabite god, Chemosh, in the liberation process. The importance of the Mesha stele also lies in the fact that it is one of the most concrete pieces of evidence of Moabite history outside the biblical scriptures. While the Bible describes King Mesha and his actions, the inscription offers a Moabite version of events, providing a contrast to the biblical accounts. This not only helps corroborate the existence of King Mesha and his revolt, but also sheds light on aspects of the relationship between Moab and Israel that are often mentioned more vaguely in the Bible. From an archaeological perspective, the Mesha stele provides valuable data on the language, culture, and religious practices of the Moabites. For example, the stele mentions human sacrifice and Moabite religious practices, which helps to better understand the spiritual and cultural context of the kingdom. Furthermore, the inscription is one of the earliest written pieces of evidence of conflict between two Semitic peoples, something that is reflected in the history of Israel and its neighbors. On a deeper level, the Mesha inscription is also a reminder of the complex interactions between ancient nations. While Moab was often in conflict with Israel, the Mesha stele reminds us that the relationships between ancient peoples were multifaceted. Ultimately, the story of Moab and its struggle for independence was not just a battle for land, but also a fight for identity, religious freedom, and self-determination. Mesha's revolt against Israel was one of the most dramatic and significant episodes in Moabite history. After the death of King Ahab of Israel, the Kingdom of Israel entered a period of instability, and Moab, which had been subjugated by the Israelites for a long time, saw an opportunity to free itself from the dominion that had weighed upon them. King Mesha, fearless and determined to restore Moab's sovereignty, was the leader who led this decisive rebellion. Mesha's motivation was clear. He sought to regain independence and dignity for his people. During the time that Moab was under Israeli rule, the Moabites were forced to pay heavy tributes and suffered constant oppression. The situation was unsustainable, and the people of Moab longed for freedom. The death of Ahab, the king of Israel, left a power vacuum that Mesha quickly took advantage of to begin his revolt. According to the Mesha inscription, the Moabite king describes how, after the death of Ahab, he was able to gather his armies and march against the Israelite forces. The battle culminated in the capture of several key Israelite cities, such as Nebo, and the destruction of their centers of power. Mesha not only defeated the Israelite army, but also restored the territories that had been lost during the previous subjugation. The revolt was not just a series of military victories. It was also deeply symbolic for the Moabite people. The victory over Israel represented the return of independence, autonomy, and self-assertion for Moab, which saw itself, once again, as a significant force in the region. Additionally, Mesha's revolt provided an opportunity to restore Moab's religious power, with the god Chemosh being invoked during the struggle for freedom. The return to the worship of Chemosh, a deity associated with war and fertility, was seen as an act of national and religious reaffirmation. The impact of Mesha's revolt was significant not only for Moab, but also for Israel and other neighboring nations. The Israelite defeat, coupled with the rise of Moab, had political and strategic repercussions across the region. Although Israel faced this temporary setback, Moab knew that its new status as an independent nation could be vulnerable to retaliation from other powers, such as the Assyrians, who were beginning to consolidate their empire in the region. Mesha's revolt was also important because it highlighted the instability that characterized the balance of power in the ancient Near East. While some nations rose, others experienced rapid ascensions and falls. However, Moab would not remain an independent power for long. The dominance of other powers, such as Assyria and Babylon, would eventually suffocate Moab's autonomy. But for a brief period, Mesha's revolt was a symbol of the resistance power of a small kingdom that rebelled against a larger empire. This episode also illustrates the complex dynamics between ancient Semitic peoples, like Moab and Israel. Even though they were enemies throughout history, the two kingdoms shared a common ancestry and intertwined destinies in the biblical narratives. Mesha's revolt and the subsequent triumph of Moab serve as a reminder of the resilience of a people willing to fight for freedom and the preservation of their culture and religion, even when victory seemed unlikely. Moab, although often remembered for its interactions with Israel and military conflicts, also had a rich and complex culture that reflected the influences and traditions of other Semitic peoples in the region. Moabite culture, marked by its religion, customs, and language, had deep roots in the ancient civilizations of the Near East, and its legacy remains visible today through inscriptions and other archaeological artifacts. The Moabite language, for example, was a Semitic dialect closely related to Hebrew. This is not surprising, considering that Moab and Israel shared a common origin. The Moabites spoke a form of Proto-Hebrew, but with distinct characteristics that reflected the nuances of their cultural identity. This Moabite dialect served as a link between them and other Semitic peoples, such as the Ammonites, Phoenicians, and Arameans. The language not only served as a means of communication, but also reflected the history and values of Moab, and was used in inscriptions and other important documents, such as the aforementioned Mesha stele. The Moabite script, although inspired by the Phoenician alphabet, had its own variations, demonstrating the individuality of the kingdom. The use of this script in stele and inscriptions was a way to record history, but also to assert the power and authority of its kings. The Moabites were skilled at creating detailed inscriptions about their victories and significant events, as seen in the example of the Mesha stele, which preserved for posterity the narrative of Mesha's revolt against Israel. Culturally, Moab had a strong emphasis on religion. The Moabites worshipped Chemosh, a god associated with war and fertility. Moabite religiosity was deeply intertwined with their military victories and hopes for the future. Sacrifices were made to Chemosh, and some of these practices included human sacrifices, which shocked the Israelites and other neighboring peoples. Devotion to Chemosh was not only a matter of religious belief, but also a demonstration of strength and national identity. The Moabites viewed their gods as protectors, warriors, and benefactors, and their victories were attributed to divine intervention. Furthermore, Moabite culture reflected a strong sense of national identity, which was tied to their land and autonomy. Even when the kingdom was subjugated, the Moabite people continued to fight for their independence and preserve their cultural traditions. This identity was central to Moab's resistance against Israel and other neighboring powers, as demonstrated in Mesha's revolt. Preserving their language, religious traditions, and history was vital to maintaining the cohesion and continuity of the Moabite people, even in the face of adversity. Moabite art also reflects this unique cultural identity. The artistic representations that have survived to this day, such as those found on ceramics and other artifacts, show influences from other Semitic cultures, but with a distinctive Moabite signature. Moabite artistic style was not only decorative, but often carried symbolic meanings, reflecting the people's relationship with their gods, kings, and land. In terms of social customs, the Moabites shared similarities with the Israelites, especially regarding hospitality practices and family norms. Like the Israelites, the Moabites valued family and lineage, and marriage, particularly among members of noble lineages, was a way to consolidate alliances and strengthen the kingdom's position. This is exemplified in the story of Ruth, the Moabite, who by marrying Boaz, not only established a bond between Moab and Israel, but also influenced the biblical narrative by becoming part of the genealogy of King David and, consequently, Jesus. Moabite culture, therefore, was shaped by a combination of religious, linguistic, and social elements, making it unique and distinct, but also connected to other Semitic cultures in the region. The cultural richness of Moab, although often overshadowed by its interactions with Israel and other neighbors, holds an important place in the history of the ancient Near East, reflecting both the victories and struggles of a people who constantly fought for their autonomy and identity. At the height of his reign, King David consolidated Israel's power, expanding its territory and asserting its authority over neighboring nations. Among these nations was Moab, which, despite its previous resistance and various attempts to maintain independence, would eventually become part of the growing Israelite empire under David's command. The conquest of Moab was not only a military act, but also a milestone in Israel's history and in the complex relationship between the two peoples. David, known for his military and strategic prowess, knew that the threat from the Moabites was still significant. Therefore, after securing victory over his more immediate enemies, such as the Philistines, he turned his attention eastward, where Moab was located. The Moabite king, aware of David's rise and military strength, found himself faced with a difficult decision: continue resisting or submit to Israelite power. However, Moab's resistance would not last long, and the battle for the kingdom's independence would come to an end. According to the scriptures, David, upon conquering Moab, divided the land into 3 parts, allowing the Moabite kingdom to be subdued while still maintaining some autonomy. Many Moabites were forced to pay tribute to Israel, while others were captured and taken as prisoners to serve the new Israelite empire. Although Moab had lost its political independence, David's treatment of the Moabite kingdom was relatively strategic. Rather than completely destroying the Moabite people, he sought to incorporate Moab into the Israelite empire, making them vassals. However, the conquest of Moab was not without its challenges. Moabite resistance was fierce, and David's forces had to face hard battles to secure the victory. During this period, King David's figure was reinforced as a leader not only military, but also as a ruler capable of making pragmatic decisions, balancing the need to expand Israel's territory with the preservation of political and economic stability. For David, Moab represented a strategic key in the region, and his victory over the Moabite kingdom solidified his position as one of Israel's greatest leaders. The impact of David's conquest of Moab was significant. By securing control of Moab, David gained control of a rich and strategic region located east of the Dead Sea, which further strengthened Israel's trade routes and security. Moreover, the victory over Moab was a symbol that Israel, under David's reign, had become a regional power capable of subjugating and incorporating other nations into its empire. Although Moab had been subdued, David also demonstrated moments of cooperation with the Moabites. For example, when fleeing from Saul, he sought refuge in the land of Moab, bringing his family with him, showing that while Moab had become a vassal nation, there was still a relationship of respect between the two peoples. This episode, where David sought shelter among his former enemies, illustrates the complexity of diplomatic and political relations at the time. David's conquest of Moab also left a mark on Israel's history, especially when observing how the Moabites were treated after their subjugation. Although they were forced to pay tribute, many Moabites continued to play an important role in the regional context, and the impact of this conquest extended for several generations. David's relationship with Moab reflected the multifaceted nature of his reign. the ability to be a warrior king, but also a wise and diplomatic ruler, knowing when to form alliances and when to use force. Therefore, David's conquest of Moab was not just a military victory, but a demonstration of his skill in consolidating and expanding the Israelite empire, while pragmatically and strategically handling the subordination of the defeated peoples. After David's ascension, his son Solomon took the throne of Israel, ruling during a period of relative peace and prosperity. Solomon's reign is often remembered for his great achievements: the construction of the Temple of Jerusalem, the strengthening of trade routes, and the establishment of diplomatic alliances with various nations. During this time, Moab underwent a significant change in its relationship with Israel. While still under Israel's indirect control, the tension between the two peoples decreased, giving way to an era of cooperation and diplomacy. Solomon, known for his wisdom and political vision, adopted a more diplomatic approach toward Moab, preferring to establish peaceful relations rather than prolong tensions and conflicts with his neighbors. During his reign, Moab experienced a period of relative stability as Israel's power focused primarily on trade and internal prosperity. The military and territorial pressure on Moab diminished, and the Moabite kingdom had the opportunity to recover from its previous confrontations with Israel. Moab's strategic geography, located east of the Dead Sea, continued to be a point of interest for the Israelites, but Solomon, with his diplomatic approach, understood that peace with Moab was beneficial for both kingdoms. The stability in the region allowed trade routes to thrive, bringing wealth and prosperity to both kingdoms. The relationship between Moab and Israel, free from past hostilities, opened the door for cultural, economic, and even religious exchanges, though on a limited scale. Solomon, known for his royal marriages, also married a Moabite princess, a symbolic gesture of goodwill and an effort to solidify peace. This marriage can be seen as a way to ensure Moab's cooperation, aligning with the diplomatic practice of the time, where marriages between royal houses were used to seal agreements and strengthen ties between kingdoms. Although the specific details of this marriage are scarce in the scriptures, the fact that it is mentioned suggests Solomon's interest in maintaining good relations with Moab, recognizing the importance of not letting historical tensions interfere with his prosperous reign. Moreover, during Solomon's reign, Moab not only benefited from peace, but was also influenced by the reforms and administrative innovations that marked Israel's governance. The construction of infrastructure, such as roads and ports, facilitated trade, and the growth of trade cities across the region benefited both Israel and Moab. While the relationship remained one of a vassal kingdom politically, the balance between the two peoples was maintained during this period of relative tranquility. It is important to note, however, that the peace between Moab and Israel during Solomon's reign was not absolute. Deep religious and cultural differences still existed between the two peoples, especially due to the worship of gods like Chemosh in Moab, which was viewed with skepticism and aversion by Israel. The temptation for the introduction of Moabite religious practices into Israel was always present, as shown by the episode involving Solomon's Moabite wife, who, according to the scriptures, led the king to stray from his devotion to God, contributing to Israel's spiritual decline in his later years. Thus, while Moab enjoyed a period of stability during Solomon's reign, the relationship between the two peoples was complex, marked by diplomatic coexistence, but also underlying tensions related to religion and cultural identity. Solomon's reign, with its political wisdom and vision of peace, was crucial in avoiding open conflict, but it did not prevent the historical and cultural differences between Moab and Israel from continuing to influence their interactions. The peace between Moab and Israel during Solomon's reign represents an attempt to overcome past hostilities and the search for mutual stability and prosperity. However, as future events would demonstrate, this peace would be short-lived, and the ancient rivalries would not easily disappear. The prophet Jeremiah, in his book, dedicated an entire chapter to the fall of Moab, bringing a message of judgment and condemnation against the Moabite kingdom. The prophecy against Moab, recorded in Jeremiah 48, is one of the most powerful examples of how God dealt with nations that rejected his covenant and turned to idolatry and pride. Moab, although it had periods of prosperity, was marked by its worship of Chemosh, the pagan god of war and fertility, and its violent actions, which were seen as an affront to divine morality and will. Jeremiah prophesied that Moab, due to its trust in its own strength and arrogance, would face great destruction. The prophet describes in detail the imminent defeat of Moab, with its inhabitants being taken captive and the city of Kir-Hareseth, one of Moab's major centers, being destroyed. Jeremiah's message was clear. Moab would face the consequences of its idolatry and its departure from the God of Israel. Moab's judgment was not a new development. Throughout its history, the Moabite nation had several confrontations with Israel, always marked by religious and territorial hostility. Moab, on numerous occasions, seduced the Israelites to worship its gods, especially Chemosh, and this caused great spiritual instability among the people of God. Moab's relationship with Israel was a history of attempts at religious seduction, and the consequences of this were visible to anyone who closely examined the history. However, despite the dark tone of his prophecy, Jeremiah did not limit himself to condemning Moab. As in many of his other prophecies, he brought a word of hope at the end. In his mercy, God promised to restore Moab in the future. Even after the destruction and captivity, the Lord indicated that there would be a time of restoration, when Moab would rise again. This promise of restoration, although not fully detailed, was a sign that God did not completely abandon the nations that had been his enemies, showing that redemption was still possible, even for the most hostile. The contrast between judgment and the promise of restoration in Jeremiah 48 reflects the nature of God. He is just and will punish idolatry and sin, but he is also merciful and offers a chance for recovery to those who repent. The story of Moab, as described by Jeremiah, serves as a warning to all nations that turn away from God and give in to arrogance and self-sufficiency, trusting in their own gods and strengths. But it also shows that, no matter how deep the sin, divine mercy is always available to those who seek repentance. The prophecy against Moab, with its vivid images of destruction, is a portrait of the seriousness of sin and its consequences, but it is also a message of hope for all who turn to God, even in the most difficult circumstances. The restoration promised to Moab, although not explicitly realized in history, suggests that even nations that were defeated and disappeared may, in some way, experience God's favor, as long as they repent of their idolatrous practices. Finally, the prophecy against Moab teaches us that pride and reliance on one's own strength are dangerous and can lead to downfall. But it also reminds us that, even amid discipline, God's grace and mercy can bring renewal and restoration. With the growing power of great empires like Assyria and later Babylon, the small nations around Israel, such as Moab, began to lose their independence. The rise of these empires was a tide that swallowed everything in its path, and Moab was no exception. For centuries, the Moabite kingdom managed to maintain itself as a political entity, sometimes through alliances and at other times resisting Israelite rule. However, the arrival of larger powers profoundly altered the power balance in the region. Moab, which had long struggled to preserve its identity and independence, now found itself facing an irresistible threat. Assyria, with its unmatched military strength, had already begun crushing neighboring kingdoms, and Moab was in the path of its expansion. When Babylon took control after defeating the Assyrians, the situation for Moab worsened further. The region, once known for its political stability and economic prosperity, based on its strategic trade, became a battlefield, with Moab's independence becoming an increasingly distant memory. Moab's downfall began when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, turned his attention to the Moabite kingdom. The Moabites, already weakened by internal conflicts and pressure from neighboring empires, no longer had the resources or strength to resist effectively. The Moabite cities, once prosperous and independent, were gradually conquered, and the Moabite people were scattered or taken into captivity. In many ways, the fall of Moab symbolizes the end of an era. The kingdom, which had been a persistent adversary to Israel and other nations around it, was swallowed by the tide of change brought on by the great empires. The Babylonian rule, with its heavy demands and relentless nature, left no room for the Moabites to maintain their autonomy. This end of Moab as an independent kingdom is a landmark in the region's history, a clear sign that the small nations could no longer compete with the rising military powers. But beyond that, it also reflects the recurring theme in the scriptures about the transience of human kingdoms. Moab, with its history of struggles and triumphs, and its resistance to Israel, disappeared as a political entity, leaving a void in its wake. Its fall was not just a military defeat, but the end of a cultural and religious legacy that for many centuries had shaped the region. However, despite its fall, the Moabite people did not disappear completely from history. Although Moab was absorbed by larger empires, its descendants continued to exist in some form, either through prophecies that still mention them or through the residual influence of their culture and traditions. Moab, as an independent nation, disappeared, but its mark on history was not completely erased. This process of assimilation, however, was not without pain. The destruction of Moab, as described by the prophets, was devastating, and the loss of its autonomy was felt not only by the Moabites, but also by the Israelites, who saw in this decline a reflection of the fragility of human kingdoms before the power of God. Thus, the fall of Moab serves as a reminder of the fleeting nature of nations, the fragility of political structures, and the supremacy of the divine forces that ultimately govern over all the earth. After the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the lives of the Israelites changed drastically. The people of Israel, who had been scattered among various nations, now faced the great challenge of rebuilding their identity and re-establishing their relationship with God. During this post-exilic period, the relationship between Israel and its former rivals, such as Moab, also took new directions. Moab, as an independent nation, had already disappeared from the pages of history. The rise of the empires that dominated the region, Assyria, Babylon, and eventually Persia, absorbed the neighboring nations, including the Moabites. However, even without a nation of their own, the Moabites were not entirely ignored. They were still mentioned in scriptures and historical texts, as a reminder of the ancient rivalries and interactions between the two peoples. During the return from exile, when the Israelites began rebuilding Jerusalem and restoring their religious life, there was a clear emphasis on preserving Israelite identity and avoiding the influence of foreign nations, especially those with which they had had tense relations, like Moab. Ezra and Nehemiah, key leaders during this period, were adamant in instructing the people to avoid mixed marriages with foreigners, particularly Moabites. This prohibition aimed to protect the purity of Israelite faith, as historically, the Moabites had led the Israelites into idolatry by seducing them to worship their gods, such as Chemosh. The story of Ruth, the Moabite, remains a notable exception to this rule. Although Ruth's lineage acted as a bridge between Israel and Moab, and she was incorporated into the genealogy of David, the people of Israel became increasingly cautious regarding any possible association with the Moabites in the post-exilic period. The concern for preserving identity and faith during a time of reconstruction and spiritual renewal made interactions with neighboring nations more suspicious. However, despite this cautious and even hostile stance toward Moab, there was a part of the population that kept alive the memory of the old times, when the Moabites were considered enemies, but were also part of redemption stories like Ruth's. Moab, as a nation, had fallen, but its memories still permeated the traditions and stories of Israel, reflecting the complex relationships between the two peoples over the centuries. This tension between the need to maintain spiritual purity and the acceptance of Moab's history is an example of the complex dynamics of coexistence between nations that, even after having been enemies, still played an important role in the history of God's people. In the post-exilic period, Moab, though no longer a military threat, still had symbolic and spiritual significance, representing both the fight against idolatry and the possibility of redemption. Thus, while Moab may have disappeared as a political entity, its presence was still felt in Israel's collective imagination, as a reminder of the spiritual forces that shaped the history of both peoples, in terms of both discipline and divine grace. The history of Moab, although marked by conflicts and rivalries with Israel, reveals a profoundly significant dimension in God's grand plan of redemption. The inclusion of Ruth, the Moabite, in the lineage of David, and consequently in the genealogy of Jesus, is a powerful testimony of divine grace that transcends the barriers of nations, ethnicities, and origins. Ruth, a Moabite woman, was widowed at a young age and, alongside her mother-in-law Naomi, decided to leave her homeland in Moab and journey to Israel. This courageous and faithful decision by Ruth to stay with Naomi and adopt her faith was seen by God as an act of devotion and loyalty. Her choice not only guaranteed her inclusion in the Israelite community, but also made her part of the ancestral line of David, the great king of Israel. From David, the lineage would extend to the Messiah, Jesus Christ. What appears to be a simple story of loyalty and love between a woman and her mother-in-law is, in light of divine revelation, a story of great significance. The inclusion of a Moabite, a people historically hostile to Israel, into the messianic lineage demonstrates that God's plan for redemption is not limited by cultural or racial boundaries. On the contrary, he calls all nations to partake in his purpose, regardless of their origin or history. This message of inclusion and redemption resonates deeply, as it reveals that even nations and individuals who, in times past, were distant or even opposed to God's people, can be restored and become part of his divine plan. Moab, which was often a symbol of resistance and conflict for Israel, now becomes a crucial element in the story of salvation. God's grace, manifested in the acceptance of Ruth, breaks with human expectations and challenges the social and cultural norms of the time. Ruth was not only a foreign woman but a Moabite, a descendant from a controversial origin, the product of incest between Lot and his daughters. Yet, this was not an obstacle for God. Her faith and character were more significant than her background, and through her, he showed that his mercy and forgiveness have no limits. Furthermore, the story of Ruth also teaches us about the role of personal faith in redemption. Even in a cultural and historical context of rejection and separation, Ruth chose, with a sincere heart, to follow the God of Israel. Her decision transformed her life, and through her, the destiny of God's people. Therefore, Moab, with its history of conflict and downfall, becomes a fundamental part of the great mosaic of the redemption story. The inclusion of a Moabite in the lineage of Jesus not only changes the narrative about Moab, but also broadens the understanding that God's divine plan of salvation is more vast and inclusive than any human barrier can imagine. The role of Moab in the redemption story, symbolized by the figure of Ruth, reminds us that God's grace can transform even the most unlikely stories, offering everyone the opportunity to be part of his eternal plan. The story of Moab is filled with deep spiritual lessons that still resonate today. From its controversial origin to its fall as an independent nation, Moab became a symbol of how turning away from God can lead to destruction, but also how divine grace is able to transform and restore even the darkest destinies. One of the first lessons the history of Moab teaches us is about the consequences of living away from God's principles. Moab arose from an act of incest, a decision motivated by fear, and the attempt to preserve Lot's lineage after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This dark event marks the beginning of a nation that throughout its history strayed from God's ways, adopting idolatrous and cruel practices, such as human sacrifice to Chemosh, their god of war and fertility. This distance from God resulted in constant conflicts and wars, both internal and with neighboring peoples, especially Israel. Moab represented, in a way, a nation trying to thrive on its own terms, without submitting to God's will. The consequences of this were visible throughout its history, culminating in the loss of its autonomy to powerful empires such as Assyria and Babylon. But the story of Moab is not just a story of downfall. It is also a story of redemption, and the figure of Ruth, the Moabite, reflects this possibility of transformation. Ruth, unlike many of her fellow countrymen, chose to follow the God of Israel, demonstrating a faith that transcended the borders of her nation and religious separation. Her faithfulness to Naomi and to the God of Israel not only led her to be integrated into the chosen people, but also made her part of the messianic lineage of Jesus. This teaches us that, even in the face of a past marked by failure and sin, there is always an opportunity for change, for a new direction. Ruth's choice to abandon her own gods and follow the faith in Israel shows that God is capable of transforming those who turn to him with a sincere heart, regardless of their origin or history. Moreover, the story of Moab reminds us of the importance of not allowing our origins or circumstances to determine our spiritual destiny. God does not choose people based on what they were or what their lineage represented. He looks at the heart. Moab's spiritual transformation from a rebellious nation to a central element in the genealogy of Jesus is a powerful reminder that God's grace is available to all, regardless of the past. Another important point is the example of how idolatry can deeply affect a nation. Moab, with its worship of Chemosh and its practices of human sacrifice, illustrates how harmful worshiping false gods can be. Idolatry is not just a religious mistake, but a practice that corrupts the character and integrity of a people, leading them to destructive choices. However, the story of Moab also teaches us that repentance and returning to God can restore any person or nation, as exemplified by Ruth. The final lesson from the story of Moab is the demonstration of God's patience and mercy. Although Moab was often an enemy of Israel, God did not abandon it completely. He allowed Moab to exist throughout history and even offered the opportunity for redemption through figures like Ruth. This shows us that, even in the most difficult and seemingly hopeless situations, God still offers opportunities for restoration if someone is willing to seek Him. Therefore, the spiritual lessons of Moab are numerous and profound. They teach us about the consequences of sin and turning away from God, but also about the transforming grace that can restore and offer new beginnings. Moab, in its fall and redemption, reflects the human condition, with all its flaws, but also with the hope of a new beginning if we turn to the Lord with faith and repentance. The story of Moab is, in some ways, a microcosm of the dynamics of rise and fall that mark the trajectory of nations throughout history. Moab, once a prosperous nation, found itself trapped in a spiral of decline, the consequence of turning away from God. Yet, its story is not just one of destruction, but also of a lesson in restoration, a reminder that even in the most desperate situations, God's grace can bring a new opportunity for life and rebirth. In its days of ascension, Moab was a regional power. Its geographical position to the east of the Dead Sea, along with its fertile lands and thriving trade, allowed it a relative independence and influence. However, this prosperity was marked by an increasing reliance on idolatrous practices, such as the worship of the god Chemosh, and a culture that drifted away from divine principles. Wars and conflicts with neighboring peoples, such as Israel, were merely a reflection of internal tensions within a nation seeking success on its own terms, without seeking God's direction. The fall of Moab was inevitable. The nation, having turned away from the God of Israel and engaged in pagan practices, experienced the loss of its autonomy, first before the growing strength of Israel and later, with the rise of even greater powers such as the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Over time, Moab disappeared as an independent nation, absorbed by external forces and its own internal decay. However, the story of Moab doesn't end with destruction. In fact, what makes this story truly meaningful is its ability to represent the spiritual principle that even in the most dramatic falls, there is always the possibility of restoration. The figure of Ruth, the Moabite, is a clear symbol of this restoration. She, a descendant of Moab, became part of the lineage of David and ultimately of Jesus Christ, the Redeemer. This aspect of restoration is present not only in the life of individuals like Ruth, but also in the very destiny of Moab. The fact that God allowed Ruth to become one of the most important figures in the story of redemption reflects His ability to transform even the most challenging contexts. Moab, a people distant from God, had the opportunity to connect with His divine plan through an act of personal faith. God used the faithfulness of a Moabite woman to redeem a people and symbolically place them at the center of the salvation story. On the other hand, the fall of Moab also serves as a warning. It illustrates the consequences of a people choosing paths that distance them from God. When a nation turns to idolatry and rejects the divine covenant, its destiny is inevitably dark. Moab experienced this fall due to its trust in false gods and its opposition to Israel, which represented the chosen nation of God. Therefore, the destruction of Moab is a lesson about the importance of living faithfully to God and honoring His sovereignty. But restoration is not a promise just for Moab. It reminds us that God is a God of second chances, capable of transforming history and bringing life to what was lost. Just as Moab had the opportunity to be redeemed through the faith of a single person, any individual or nation can be restored if they turn to God with a repentant heart. Moab, with its story of fall and restoration, symbolizes how God works in the world, bringing forth His justice, but also His mercy. The destruction of Moab, though tragic, offers a chance for reflection on how nations and people can choose to either move away from or draw near to God. In the end, the story of Moab is not only a warning about the consequences of sin, but also a testimony that, even in the face of failure, there is always a chance for repentance and restoration. Although Moab disappeared as an independent nation, its mark on biblical history endures as a complex example of conflict, repentance, and inclusion in God's divine plan. The legacy of Moab is not merely a reflection of its victories or defeats, but also of how its actions and history influenced the course of biblical events, revealing the dynamics of God's judgment and grace. The story of Moab begins with a controversial origin, the result of an act of incest between Lot and his daughters. This event, which produced Moab and Ben-Ami, left an indelible mark on the identity of the Moabite nation. From the start, Moab was viewed with suspicion by the Israelites, and this distrust manifested in various interactions throughout history, such as territorial and cultural conflicts that shaped the relationship between the two peoples. However, Moab's relationship with Israel also has its moments of depth and transformation. One of the most notable events is the story of Ruth, the Moabite, who became one of the most significant figures in the lineage of David and eventually the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Ruth, a woman who could have easily been ignored by Israeli culture due to her origin, became a central figure in the redemption story, showing that the legacy of Moab, though complex and often troubled, could also intertwine with God's divine plan of salvation. Moreover, the name of Moab appears in several prophetic passages. In Jeremiah 48, for example, the prophecies against Moab reveal God's view of the nation's pride and idolatry, but also highlight the possibility of restoration. The central message of these prophecies is that although Moab had turned away from God and reaped the consequences of it, there was still the promise of a future redemption. This aspect of hope and restoration is crucial for understanding the legacy of Moab within the biblical narrative. Another important aspect of Moab's legacy is its role in the formation of Israel and the challenges faced by this people. The interactions between the Moabites and the Israelites, from armed conflicts to spiritual seductions, provided fertile ground for the teachings and spiritual lessons that appear throughout the scriptures. For example, the seduction of the Israelites by the Moabite gods, especially during the reign of Balak, serves as a warning about the dangers of idolatry and the need for faithfulness to God. Even though Moab was often an enemy of Israel, its story, with its victories, defeats, and even its fall as a nation, reflects the universal struggle between sin and the possibility of redemption. Moab is remembered as a nation that turned away from God, but also as an example that God's mercy can reach even the most unlikely. The fact that Ruth, a Moabite, was included in the lineage of Jesus is a powerful message that, regardless of origin or past, God has the power to transform and use anyone to fulfill his purposes. Therefore, Moab's legacy is not just that of a nation that disappeared from the pages of history, but of a spiritual symbol of the conflict between rebellion against God and the possibility of restoration through grace. The story of Moab intertwines with the story of Israel, with the story of humanity, and most importantly, with the story of redemption. Even in its fall, Moab leaves lessons of humility, repentance, and God's continuous offer of forgiveness and transformation. And so we conclude the fascinating story of Moab, a nation marked by conflict, falls, and also the possibility of redemption, with a legacy that resonates to this day. Moab teaches us much about pride, idolatry, and above all, about the divine grace that transforms even the darkest paths. If you enjoyed this video and learned something new about Moab and its history, don't forget to hit the like button to show your support. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive more amazing content on biblical history and other curiosities. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know what you think about Moab's legacy and how this story connects with what we live today. Until the next video, and remember, history always has something to teach us.